USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. An in-depth look at this week's top college hockey matchup and a preview of the other big games.
Welcome to the USCHO Game of the Week podcast for Thursday, February 17th, 2022. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. This podcast episode is brought to you by DCU Digital Federal Credit Union. What will DCU mean to you? Find out today by visiting dcu.org. Membership required. There are always big games in the NCHC, but the one that's our game of the week this week is number 9, North Dakota, and number 7, Minnesota Duluth.
And joining us now on the Game of the Week podcast to talk really all things NCHC is their longtime, I think we can call him the OG of NCHC broadcasts on CBS Sports Network. That's Dave Starman. Starman, welcome into the podcast. Hey, I'm going to jump right into it. Right now, NCHC has 5 teams in the top 10 of the USCHO.com poll. 4 of those teams, they're actually going to play one another this weekend. We were talking on our Monday podcast with Derek Schooley, about the Big Ten and the fact that they've got, basically the top team in the pairwise. They have, a really good team in Minnesota that's maybe doing better than people thought they would late in the season. And we said that maybe the Big Ten is maybe the best conference in college hockey. Now, I know you love to say that the NCHC is. Here's your chance on the pulpit. What's your case for best conference in college hockey for the NCHC, if that indeed is still your position?
I want to quote Chris Bayon, who I think had perhaps the best perspective on this that I've heard when it comes to the Big Ten and the NCHC, because I think they're both very good. Chris said to me, the Big Ten probably has more players that you're scared of. And we talked about Cole Caulfield and Turcotte and Holloway and Power and Beniers and Johnson and Sam Iskevich. He said they probably have more of the players that would worry you. The NCHC has got more teams that will worry you because they're older, they're a little heavier, they're veteran-like, they're a little bit more hockey savvy, they're better put together, their core is older because it's been together for longer, they've won more. And I thought it was a really good comparison. And when you think about it, there's a lot of merit to that statement because while the NCHC, I think, has got a lot of really good players. I mean, let's start with that. There's a lot of really high-end guys in the NCHC. Sometimes you get a little bit more of the high, flashy, top number 1 draft pick type players playing in the Big Ten because of the bright, shiny object attraction to some of those schools. But when you think about it, think about the way that the NCHC teams are constructed and what their rosters look like. And a few of the players in that conference that transferred in this year all said to me, it is great to play in the NCHC because every weekend you are playing against rosters where a good chunk of them are not only going to play in the NHL or the American League or play pro in Europe. Like, you're playing against pros every week, and it allows you to see where you are as a player and how you could potentially shake out as a pro playing against guys that are going to be pros. So when it comes to what's the best, I mean, I do think top to bottom, the NCHC is probably a little deeper, but I think that Mayo nailed it with that quote. And to me, it's the best perspective on those 2 conferences.
You have seen a lot of these teams by now. Have you seen, you've probably seen all 8 by now at this point, have you?
Yes, I have. Yep.
Do you feel there is one that at this point, I know Denver has gone on a nice run that ended last weekend, but is there one team to you that really stands out and might be a notch or 2 above the rest?
You mentioned it. I think Denver's got a couple things going for it. Number 1 is their top 4 defensemen are really, really good in all areas of the game. And their third pairing is really dependable and could be a second pairing just about anywhere else. So I think on the back end, they're solid. I think their goaltender, Magnus Krona, who last year I was not in love with, has really changed his game, has improved his game. Ryan Massa is the goalie coach there, who, as we know, took Omaha to the Frozen Four a few years ago. And Massa has tightened him up, cleaned him up, and made him much more efficient in the crease in terms of getting to his spots better. And up front, they're 4 deep down the middle. Their top 3 lines create a lot of matchup issues for some other teams. And so to me, I think Denver right now is a cut ahead of everybody else in the conference. That being said, have fun dealing with North Dakota, Duluth, St. Cloud. and Western on any given night. Once you get into the regionals, like if you're outside the conference and you're going to run up against that, have fun with it.
Dave, how about the job that Bradbury has done this year? He lost players to the pros. Arguably, the best player on the team has been away at the Olympics. He's had a short roster. What kind of a coaching job has Brad done this year?
I think Brad and his staff run that program in a way that regardless of who's in the lineup, you're expected to do the job that you're given that night. And they run it with such a pro mentality. And what I mean by that is when you're at the pro level, and I've been lucky enough to be there, when you're at the pro level, players understand it's about doing their job and not about doing anybody else's. And I think at North Dakota, they've done a really good job at implementing a way to play by where you worry about what you have to do and not necessarily about what anybody else has to do. And therefore, the trust factor and the reliance on all 5 players on the ice to do what's expected of them makes the game a little bit easier to play. Now, they're not as high-end this year as they have been in recent years, but yet they're still competing. They're still playing hard. They're still keeping the goals against down. Driscoll's been great in net form. That was a good pickup. But I just think that their mentality, their culture, and their structure allow them to be very good, even if their lineup is not as good as the one that they're going to face. I think Brad and his staff have done a wonderful job.
When you talk culture, I always think about, when I think about Bradbury, I think about the press conference after they won in 2016 in Tampa. And before Brad would take any questions, first thing he had to do was go over and hug each of his players. He seems to build a very personal bond as well as building a good structure.
You know, he's Jim Valvano minus the gregarious personality. Like he's got such a family type atmosphere. I will tell you this, he can make people uncomfortable there. Like he can get them out of their comfort zone and he can have them walking on eggshells, and he is very demanding. And the last thing you want to do is be at a meeting on a Saturday morning when you lose Friday night, because then the hammer comes down. But Brad's got a way of relating to his players just because of the family guy that he is. But he makes everybody understand that it can't be all huggy-feely all the time. But I think he's gotten them to the point where they understand that when he raises his voice and he gets mad and he starts yelling, it's not specific, it's to be heard. And players there understand that they can make a mistake and still be back in the lineup or be back on the ice for their next shift.
Right now on the outside looking in, the top 4 is St. Cloud State. Brett Larson had them in the national championship game last year. Has this team lost something, or is it just that the other 4 above them are so tough to play against?
Oh, that's a good question. They brought back, most of their team is back, and they've had some injuries. Henches has been kind of in and out, and they've had some injuries, and then Brett goes to the Olympics, and that disrupts the thing. Even though Dave Shayak is a real good head coach, they got a good staff there. St. Cloud's been a weird team, and I think that when you watch them play through the course of the year, they've just had some inconsistencies. I think it's a good team, and to me, I think they are probably a little bit better in the underdog role than they are in the favorite role. So they may be sitting right exactly where they want to be. And I would tell you this, dealing with Brett and teams he's been around and what St. Cloud has been about, this is another team that is very reliant on process and not necessarily staring at the results every weekend. But, in chatting with a lot of those guys and watching them play, I think for me, they're starting to come back together again, because when they've lost, they haven't been awful. They've just made some mistakes that to me are uncharacteristic of a good team. But I think that once they have their team back together to the point where the guys who they brought back are all now playing again, then they're going to make life a little bit more miserable for some opponents. And I'll tell you what, right now they're shaping up to play Duluth in the 4-5. Good luck with that, trying to pick that series, because that could be an epic.
Dave, you'll call the game in Duluth on Friday night with North Dakota and Minnesota Duluth. You just kind of alluded that Minnesota feels like they're going to be in that 4 seed, but if they want to do some movement and maybe even secure things for the national picture, how important does this weekend series become for them?
I think it's important for a lot of reasons. The ones you just mentioned, for sure. But you're getting to the point now in that conference where it's about what it's going to look like moving forward to the national tournament. The frozen face-off, unless you've been around it, the frozen face-off is like the old WCHA Final Five. It's intense. And I've watched teams get into that tournament and get so emotionally wrapped up in winning the frozen face-off or the Final Five that they limp into the regionals the following weekend. They're spent. So, but I think that for both of these teams, especially for UMD, this is one of those weekends where, hey, now let's start putting the pieces in place that we're going to continue to build on to get us through the playoffs, to get us through the frozen face-off, and get us into the national tournament. Because I'm telling you, while winning the Penrose and winning the NCHC is important, all these teams right now are on this week-by-week basis building process to get themselves to Boston. And there's 5 teams that I think realistically in this conference can get there.
Well, Dave Starman, CBS Sports Network, you're going to see a good one this weekend. You're going to see some good hockey down the stretch in the NCHC and right through the frozen face-off. So enjoy that, and thanks so much for your time, and hopefully we can catch up as we get toward the postseason.
Oh, Jim, Ed, anytime. You guys take care. Stay safe.
More of the Game of the Week podcast in a moment. This episode is brought to you by DCU, Digital Federal Credit Union. Visit dcu.org.
This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Know how people say life happens? Well, for me, life was happening, and I needed a new truck. I didn't have time to shop around for a good loan, so I got one from the dealer, higher interest and all. Month after month, those payments were squeezing me. So I went to DCU. They refinanced my loan and helped lower my rate, which lowered my payments. These days, I have more money in my pocket for whatever life throws at me. What will DCU mean to you? Insured by NCUA. Membership required. Visit dcu.org.
We're back with the Game of the Week podcast. Jim, let's start out with the game we were just talking about with Dave Starman. Number 9, North Dakota at number 7, Minnesota Duluth. Last weekend, UMD split with Denver, and North Dakota swept Colorado College. So North Dakota is really positioned well in second place in the NCHC, and Minnesota Duluth is fighting to hold on to at least 4th place in the standings, so they get home ice in the first round.
Yeah, there's some importance for both teams, but for different reasons. Obviously, Minnesota Duluth is trying to move up in the standings. They're trying to at least solidify that home ice spot. North Dakota, despite the fact that they're in second place, a couple of losses here and there can pull them closer to the NCAA bubble. They're not in the as good of an NCAA position as much of the rest of their league is. So I think that, if you're the Fighting Hawks, every game right now matters just so you can make that postseason NCAA tournament.
You mentioned Denver splitting with Minnesota Duluth. They are in for a pair of games at Western Michigan. Last weekend, the Broncos got 2 of 6 points, a tie with a shootout win, and then a loss at St. Cloud State. Pretty pivotal game for Western Michigan and for Denver. Denver wanting to maintain top spot in the NCHC, and Western Michigan trying to recoup after not a bad weekend, but not a great one.
Yeah, certainly. And, I look at Western and, they were rolling since the new year. When you really look at things, they sweep North Dakota. They split with Minnesota Duluth on the road, though, and find a way to win the second game in overtime. Then they sweep CC on the road, and then they end that road trip with 2 against St. Cloud State. They get 2 out of 6 points on the weekend, which probably doesn't feel like enough, because you're not really maintaining. Now you finally back home. This has been a long road trip, 3 straight weeks away from home. Now you've got Denver at home, and I don't want to say this Denver team, is vulnerable despite the fact that they split last weekend. They're a darn good hockey team, and arguably, as you heard Dave Starman say, the best team in the NCHC, just kind of a notch above everybody else. And I think this is a weekend that Western would love to use their home ice advantage, which can be a really strong one, to its advantage. But this is a tough opponent, and you know that Denver not getting the sweep last weekend will come in a little bit more hungry.
Let's turn to the Big Ten. A huge matchup is number 11 Ohio State travels to number 2 Michigan. The Buckeyes were swept by Minnesota last weekend at home. Meanwhile, Michigan had a sweep over arch rival Michigan State. Michigan has been vulnerable at home on Friday nights.
Yeah, it has. And that's one of those strange anomalies of a schedule. And we had talked to Mel Pearson. He said that there's some distractions at home. They're a better road team than they are at home, and that has proven itself out this season. Just 2 losses all season on the road. I think there's a big question mark for Michigan going into this weekend. And I'm starting as, it's Thursday and we're starting to see things become answered. It does not sound like any of the Olympic players will be back in the lineup for these teams this weekend. They're out of Beijing, but last I heard they're in Tokyo. There was, the flights coming home were not a great situation. So it's not likely that any of the absences that Michigan had because of the Olympics will return to the lineup this weekend. So that kind of does level the playing field a little bit. And you're going to have a really hungry Ohio State team that I think is probably a little disappointed not getting some points from Minnesota a weekend ago.
Let's stay out west. Number 1, Minnesota State, which had a bye weekend last weekend, has Bemidji State coming in. The Beavers split with Northern Michigan. Minnesota State can clinch the CCHA this weekend. Bemidji State still battling for the upper part of the league.
Yeah, and Bemidji has a little bit of a bubble between them and Lake Superior, which is down in 5th place. That is the key. You want to stay and make sure you're staying at home in that first round of the playoffs. So if you can find a way to get a couple more wins, that would help a lot. But this is a tough opponent. And you know that Minnesota State, this has been a team in recent years. They've won a lot of conference tournaments, whether, the WCHA, obviously before the CCHA. And when my memory serves me right, when they've had chances to close things out, they're excellent at closing things out. So keep an eye on that one this weekend. I do think that, Bemidji needs a win or more this weekend. They'd love to get that, but this is a tough opponent. I do think, we've talked on our Monday podcast with Derek Schooley, and he likes Bemidji. Is now just seeing this team, kind of show up in the big moment that is the big question mark.
And let's turn to Hockey East. 2 teams sort of licking their wounds right now. Providence, who lost to BU, a Terriers team that is probably one of the hottest teams in college hockey right now. But the Friars come in 1-3 in their last 4. Meanwhile, UMass Lowell, hosting Providence, lost last weekend to Northeastern and to New Hampshire.
2 teams that absolutely, their recent performances just befuddle me. And for Providence, it's a little worse because, UMass Lowell, they've had their struggles. They're still sitting tied for first place, though, Massachusetts, who they're tied with, has games in hand. And, you have to believe that the Minutemen, probably have the upper hand and the opportunity to clinch first place. But you at least you're in, even call yourself tied for first, you're in second place, in a very tight top of the league. I understand that, Lowell, I think, can still finish as low as 7th, but you have Providence that's in 7th right now. And that just blows my mind because this Providence team feels better than the record it has performed with on the ice. They have had over time, they have had Lowell's number, especially in the regular season. Lowell has had some good postseason performances and huge wins in the Hockey East tournament against Providence, but in the regular season, Providence has really done well against the Riverhawks. So this is a much needed series for both teams. It's just a question of which team will show up and kind of take charge in what it could be a really crucial weekend.
Well, you can read about all these games and see what the odds makers think of the matchups in the USCHO Bettor's Edge column, plus the picks from the Division I correspondents and writers at USCHO.com. This podcast has been brought to you by DCU, Digital Federal Credit Union. What will DCU mean to you? Find out today by visiting dcu.org. Membership required. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.